But in that summary, we are also summarizing what are the resources available, because everybody is looking at the resources. So we again, and what are the revenue-raising measures? Of course, in the end, everybody tries to look at the revenue-raising measures without looking, first of all, their policies and programs. That's where we are. Let me say this, maybe as an opening statement, is that we have come from a very, very, very difficult period. And we are happy that with the leadership of His Excellency President William Ruto and his deputy, Honorable Rigathi Gachagua, they have stabilized the economy. We have come from very difficult times. We have seen some few signals which are very, very strong. For example, the 2023 growth, economic growth was actually 5.6%. We have seen inflation coming down to 5%, to its target level in April. In May, it went to 5.1%, which is actually not significant. So it means that inflation has come down to its target. We have seen stability in the exchange rate, in the nominal exchange rate. The nominal exchange rate is the national relative price, so it tells us about stability in the totality of the economy. And there are so many other aspects that we can relate to. That tells us that there is a very strong, should I say, very strong evidence that economic recovery has started, starting from the last quarter of 2023. But it is also a very fragile recovery, given the way you have seen the shocks from 2021, the COVID, 2020, the COVID, 2021 to 2022, there was massive. We haven't seen that drought in 40 years. 2023, El Nino hit us very hard. 2024, floods are still continuing. Go back a little, then 2021, 2022, supply constraints, 22, global dollar shortage. And you can see all these, we lump them as negative shocks. They are persistent because we don't even know when they end, isn't it? And they create some permanent effect in the economy. In fact, one of the estimates is to show that we have been reversed. We have reversed our 20 years effort in terms of poverty reduction and inequality. The drought itself affected not only household inequality but also regional inequality in a big way. It is one of the most catastrophic issues that you can deal. So what are we saying? We are saying strong evidence of economic recovery. But that recovery is fragile. It has to be supported. Strong policies, strong policy reforms, strong programs, and very, very strong and targeted interventions. Interventions to correct virtually everything. This is how to put, that is the way we need to support it. You can imagine, for example, right now, every time we turn, what is one of the damaging, or should I say, severe problems that we face? Debt, isn't it? We have to solve it with different dimensions. The most important thing is to realize that every time the budget is mentioned, everybody talks about taxes, revenue measures, revenue-raising measures. But that is just one component. You're asking yourself, why do we raise revenue? There is one problem I want to emphasize. But it is not one problem. It is actually one problem in three problems. We call them trilemma. There is one dilemma, but composed of three dilemmas, so we call it a trilemma. One of the things is that everything and everywhere you turn, everyone wants government to spend more, to increase expenditure. We want roads, we want electricity, healthcare, education. So everybody wants the government to spend more. But for government to finance those aspects, healthcare, infrastructure, electricity, education, all those, it requires a lot of revenue. The only way you can finance that is through tax revenue or debt. Debt has, the second problem is that you have limitations in terms of debt. Debt today can be income, but debt tomorrow is going to be an expenditure. The third problem is that if you can't finance those revenues or those expenditures through debt, then you have to finance them through taxes. And everyone resists high taxes. So that's why we call it a trilemma, or a three-dimensional problem. It's one problem in three problems. But we are going to overcome by looking at moderate ways of trying to solve the problem. So the budget today is going to emphasize on the policies that we need to implement, policies, programs, and intervention to implement to support that fragile growth, that fragile economic recovery. We want to make sure that we revive the economy so that it can generate jobs for the youth. And that's where we are. Simple as that. We want to revive the economy so that we can pay our debt. We have been buffeted by debt, and everybody has seen us moving from moderate risk to high risk of debt distress, isn't it? So essentially, it is something you read, you write in the papers every day. So we are confronting all these problems. And on top of that, we have to build roads, we have to support hospitals, and that's why we are reforming even the hospital, the universal health care. There's the school program. We have a new school program. We have a financing model. And we all have to support that in terms of resources. So in a sense, what we are doing is to summarize all that we have got from both MDAs and government institutions, plus the private sector, and then public participation in terms of what they have brought to us. That's what we summarize, that's what we present. But this year's budget, we want to emphasize two things. First, we have to protect that economic recovery. You can only protect that economic recovery through policy reforms, through the diverse measures of raising revenues, through programs, and through interventions. Okay? That is the most important thing. The second thing is that the policy reforms must go in different dimensions. With some of you, I don't know whether you look at data. If you look at our exports, manufacturing exports, there has been a secular decline of manufacturing export. It means that it is very difficult for the manufacturing sector to increase jobs. So in a sense, we have to look at it in terms of how do we resuscitate our exports. One of the points that has been very, very adequately talked about, and even ourselves in the National Treasury, is that we have to develop, protect, and regulate markets. Because once markets are not well regulated, they are not well governed, they collapse. They collapse with Kenya's investments. And there is no more investment in that sector. It means that poverty hits very hard. For some of you, you have written papers and articles on that. Look at the coffee sector. Look at the sugar sector. Look at the cotton sector, subsector. Wherever markets have collapsed because of poor governance, you know poverty has struck, investments have been lost, it has been very difficult to revive. Pyrethrum, okay, all those. That is one of the most important. So when I talk about policies, programs, and interventions, those are the issues that we are talking about. So markets governing is an intervention that is required. Hustler Fund is an intervention because we want to reorganize that market. We want to make sure that people move out of the bondage of, what are they called, Shyrocks. The Shyrock is from the Merchant of Venice. I don't know why they say Shyrock. But it's a bondage of financial distress. We want to make sure that we have some interventions. So when we talk about, we need very strong policies, we need strong programs aimed at targeting different programs. By the way, when we talk about programs, we are also they are targeting programs. We want to target the youth. We want to target those people in the bottom of the pyramid in terms of what they need. That's why the Hustlers Fund is very, very important. So when we start by talking about bottom-up economic transformation agenda, you already know that bottom-up because majority of the Kenyans have been left behind, where markets have failed them, where policies have failed them, where government has not been able to invest in areas that they want, and we want to reverse all that. And those are the issues. I wanted to make those 3 points maybe so that you can have a feel that when budget making is not about taxes. Taxes comes in to say, After saying you are going to do all this, how are you going to finance it? Now,
all right, volunteers, maybe one of the things that has generated a lot of conversations is looking at the amount of this budget that is going towards recurrent expenditure versus development. So if you could tell us, are you concerned about that as the National Treasury when we have recurrent expenditure consuming close to 70% or more than 70% of the country's budget?
Actually, 3/4 of the budget discussions, if you ask these two guys with me, has been just that. How do you balance out? Because, look, many years back, when I was the governor of the central bank, I used to argue that even in times of crisis, make sure that you do not devour the development spending because you limit capacity for future growth. That logic is still there. That's why we are saying those interventions is to protect the development expenditure. Because once you devour development expenditure, it means that you limit yourself in terms of future capacity for growth. That is why we are talking about interventions, to make sure that we safeguard some of these issues. That is why we really need that balance. But we go back to the trilemma. We go back to the trilemma. That is, I don't want to call it trilemma. You know, I just want to say it is a major problem. It is one problem, but with 3 dimensions or with 3 faces, isn't it? We want more revenues to spend. But how do we raise more revenue to spend? It's either through taxes or debt. The second problem, you have a limitation with how much debt you can carry, isn't it? The third one is that since taxes is the only one that is left now in that space, how much taxes can you raise? We also have resistance in terms of taxes. So what we are trying to do, and to answer your question, is that we are moving in a direction where we want to make sure that we have domestic resource mobilization that is amenable to the development space that we want. And we want to make sure that we limit our tax expenditure to build up a revenue base or a tax base, and also reorganize. We are trying to reform all dimensions of taxes to try and see how we can raise revenue. Mostly looking at the hard-to-tax economy. And this is some things that we are going to talk about. So in a sense, we are conscious about that. Half of the work that we do is how do we support development spending? How do we create that balance?
Okay, buenos dias. My name is Noki Kumbo from KTN News. 2 questions. The first one is, you've spoken about policies and a wider approach towards reforms. It's not just budget, but we can't ignore the impact.
We can't ignore?
We can't ignore the impact of the taxation element to several industries. For example, manufacturing. I mean, we've spoken to manufacturers over the discussion on March's finance bill. Some of them are closing up. They are thinking about relocating. How do we counter that?
There is nothing like closing up or relocating. This is a political agenda. Let me tell you, everywhere you go, we try to balance out policies so that nobody feels disadvantaged. Okay? That is a hearsay that you're talking about. Let me tell you, there is nowhere in Kenya that you have raised taxes to the point where farms can close down. Give me an example. I've been living in this country. I've done most of the policy work in my own individual capacity, and I can tell you I have all those. Don't forget, I would like you to go and read the book that we developed in 2002 when Kenyans were so depressed, and it is restarting and sustaining growth in Kenya. You read that, and you'll tell me what you have said is incorrect. If you read that, there are several chapters, you realize that what you are really saying has no basis. It is the whole issue about policy is to balance policy reforms, to balance programs, and finally, to balance interventions. There is no way you can come up with policies that kill even a household or an industry. So let's move away from those points that have no even relevance, because it's not true. Who would want to do that?
For example, East African packaging industries.
That they have their own internal problems, my friend. You know, if you fail to compete in the world today, you cannot survive. Are we together? Let's not start an argument, because I can give you that lecture until cows come home. Huh? Okay?
All right, in closing.